Alright, let's arrive together for a second. Unclench your jaw. Drop your shoulders. You're here. Welcome back to Coremates. And today, Elen and I are talking about something that's incredibly common, but strangely hard to talk about out loud. Family who belittles you. Not loudly, not cruelly, but quietly, casually. Sometimes without even realizing they're doing it. The kind of comments that come wrapped in concern, or humor, or I'm just being honest. The kind that doesn't look like abuse, but somehow leaves you feeling smaller every time. And we want to say this clearly from the beginning. This episode is not about blaming parents, or turning siblings into villains, or cutting people out. Most of the families we're talking about here are not bad people. They love you. They worry about you. They want the best for you in the way they understand best. And at the same time, their words still land. Their tone still shapes you. Their comments still live in your nervous system long after the conversation ends. So today, we're holding both truths at once. Because here's the thing. You can understand someone's trauma and still protect yourself from its impact. You can love your family and still need boundaries. You can appreciate everything they gave you and still name what hurt. And that's what this conversation is about. How belittling shows up in close family relationships, especially with parents and siblings. Why it happens psychologically and generationally. Why it hurts so deeply even when it's subtle. And how to set boundaries that don't explode the relationship, but also don't erase you. This episode is meant to feel like two women talking honestly over coffee. No jargon overload. No cold psychology language. Just clarity, compassion, and tools that actually work in real family dynamics. So if you've ever left a family gathering feeling drained, if you've ever doubted yourself after talking to people who love you, if you've ever thought, why do I feel like a child again around them? You're exactly where you need to be. Let's talk about it. You know what I've noticed? When people talk about being hurt by family, they almost always minimize it. They say things like, it wasn't that bad. They didn't mean it like that. That's just how they are. And usually they're right. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like cruelty. But it was. Consistent. Exactly. Family belittling rarely comes in the form of obvious insults. It comes in comments that sound normal because you grew up with them. Comments that were said so early, so casually, that your nervous system accepted them as background noise. And that's what makes them powerful. It might sound like a parent saying, "You're not very practical," every time you talk about something creative. Or, "You always complicate things when you try to explain how you feel." Or even, "You'll understand when you're older, when you ask a serious question, and you're already grown." On their own, these comments don't seem harmful. But psychology shows us something important. The brain learns meaning through repetition, not intensity. So when the same subtle message shows up again and again, your nervous system absorbs it as truth. And siblings, especially, often play a big role here. Because sibling belittling often hides behind humor. You're so dramatic. You've always been the weak one. Here she goes again. Everyone laughs. You laugh too. But inside, your body registers something else. A small contraction. A tightening in the chest. A feeling of being exposed. Your nervous system is incredibly intelligent. It notices when your authenticity becomes a punchline. And here's something that's rarely said out loud. Belittling doesn't always mean being told you're bad. Sometimes it means being treated like you're less capable of knowing what you want, less capable of making decisions, less capable of handling life on your own. This is why well-meaning parents say things like, "Let me handle that for you." Or, "Are you sure you can manage this?" It comes from care, from fear, from love that's anxious. But over time, it teaches your nervous system something very specific. I am safer when someone else decides. In developmental psychology, there's a concept called attunement. Children build self-trust when their inner experiences are reflected back with respect. When they're constantly corrected, doubted, or minimized, even gently, that attunement gets disrupted. They grow up second-guessing themselves, not because they lack confidence, but because confidence was never mirrored back to them. And this is the part we want to be very clear about. Most parents and siblings who do this are not bad people. They're often repeating what they were taught. They grew up in environments where emotions were minimized, where practicality was valued over expression, where survival mattered more than sensitivity. So when they belittle, consciously or unconsciously, it's usually their own nervous system speaking. Not a verdict on your worth. But understanding their history doesn't mean ignoring your impact. Your body still learns something from those interactions. It learned when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to shrink excitement, when to doubt instinct. And that learning doesn't disappear just because you intellectually understand it. This is why so many adults say, "I feel confident everywhere else, except around my family." Because your nervous system remembers where it first learned who you were allowed to be. Once you can name this, without blame, without anger, you create space for something new. Not distance, not conflict, but discernment. And that leads us to something important. Why does this hurt more when it comes from family than from anyone else? Why do these small comments stay with us longer than criticism from strangers? There's something people often say when family comments hurt. Why does this still affect me? I'm an adult. And it's such an honest question. Because logically, you know better. You've grown. You've built your own life. You've heard feedback from bosses, friends, even strangers, and it doesn't touch you the same way. But one comment from a parent or a sibling, and suddenly you feel 12 again. That's because family doesn't just talk to you. They talk to the version of you that learned who they were in relation to them. Psychologically, family sits at the very core of your identity wiring. Before you had language, before you had logic, before you had perspective, you had them. In neuroscience, we know that early relationships shape the brain's emotional maps. The limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion and safety, develops in response to caregivers. So when a parent or a sibling reacts to you, your nervous system doesn't register it as feedback. It registers it as information about belonging. And belonging is not a small thing. Belonging is survival-level information. So even subtle belittling doesn't feel like disagreement. It feels like threat of disconnection. That's why the reaction is so strong, even when the words are mild. This is also why belittling from family often bypasses your rational mind. You can tell yourself, they didn't mean it. Or, that's their issue. But your body reacts first. The tight chest, the shallow breath, the sudden urge to defend yourself or go quiet. That's your nervous system remembering an old rule. Staying connected matters. And there's another layer here that people rarely talk about. When family belittles you, it doesn't just hurt in the moment. It activates old self-doubt. You start questioning decisions you were previously sure about. You replay conversations. You feel the urge to explain yourself, even when you don't owe an explanation. Because family voices often become internal voices. This is something psychology calls introjection. Over time, the way your family speaks to you becomes the way you speak to yourself. So when they minimize you now, it echoes something you've already internalized. That's why even loving families can create lasting wounds without intending to. Not because they were cruel, but because they were powerful. They had influence. And influence leaves marks. This is also why people feel torn. On one hand, you love your family. You know their stories. You understand their sacrifices. On the other hand, you leave interactions feeling drained, smaller, less sure of yourself. That tension creates guilt. And guilt often keeps people silent. They think, if I say something, I'm ungrateful. If I set a boundary, I'm being dramatic. If I pull back, I'm a bad child or sibling. But boundaries aren't punishment. They're regulation. Your nervous system is simply asking for consistency between love and safety. It wants connection without contraction. It wants closeness without self-erasure. And once you understand why this hurts so much, you stop judging yourself for reacting. You realize, this isn't weakness. It's biology. It's attachment. It's history. Which brings us to the next piece of this conversation. If family belittling often comes from their own unprocessed fears and experiences, what's actually happening on their side? Not to excuse it, but to understand it clearly enough that it stops defining you. Because when you can see the pattern, you can stop taking it personally. And that's where your power begins to return. You know what I've realized over the years? Most family belittling isn't actually about control. It's about fear. Yes, fear or unprocessed insecurity. And sometimes grief. People think belittling comes from arrogance, but in families, it usually comes from someone feeling small themselves. Like when a parent questions your choices constantly. On the surface, it sounds like criticism, but underneath, it's often anxiety. They're scared you'll fail in a way they never recovered from, or that you'll suffer in ways they didn't know how to protect themselves from. Or worse, that you'll outgrow them. That part is uncomfortable to admit, but it's real. When you change, it forces them to face what they never did. And siblings. That's its own world. Sibling belittling often comes from comparison that never stopped. Even in adulthood, the nervous system remembers. Who is the smart one? Who is the responsible one? Who is the difficult one? Those roles stick longer than we think. Yes, family roles are like invisible contracts. And when you start breaking them, becoming more confident, more self-directed, it unsettles the system. So the system tries to pull you back. Not consciously, not maliciously, but reflexively. I've noticed parents especially do this thing where they minimize your success. They'll say, "That's nice, but..." Or just don't get too excited. And they think they're protecting you from disappointment. Exactly. That's what psychology calls defensive pessimism. They learned that hope hurts. So they pass caution instead of encouragement. And sometimes belittling is simply the only language they know. They were raised with sarcasm, correction, comparison. No one modeled emotional validation for them. So they love you, but speak fluently only in critique. Which doesn't make them bad people. It makes them under-resourced. There's also this subtle power dynamic that never fully dissolves. Some parents struggle to see their children as separate adults. So when you assert your independence, it threatens their sense of relevance. Belittling becomes a way to stay above instead of alongside. Yes, that's an ego protection response. If they acknowledge your autonomy fully, they have to accept their role has changed. And transitions are hard, especially for people who never learned how to adapt emotionally. And here's the part that's hard to swallow. Sometimes belittling is love mixed with unresolved trauma. They want you safe. They want you close. They just don't know how to offer support without shrinking you. That's why it feels so confusing. Because you can feel their care and their harm at the same time. And holding both truths is exhausting. It creates this inner conflict where you think, if they love me, why do I feel worse after seeing them? Because love doesn't automatically equal emotional safety. And emotional safety is what your nervous system is asking for now. Understanding this changes everything. Not because it excuses their behavior, but because it frees you from internalizing it. You stop thinking, they're right about me, and start seeing, this is about them struggling to regulate themselves. And once you see that clearly, you're finally in a position to respond differently. Not with silence, not with explosions, but with boundaries that protect the relationship and your sense of self. So the next question becomes, if you can't just cut family off and you don't want to keep absorbing the damage, how do you create boundaries that don't turn into wars? Boundaries that feel calm, grounded, and sustainable. You know what took me a long time to understand? Boundaries don't have to sound like ultimatums. Thank you for saying that. Because when people hear boundaries, they imagine speeches, or confrontation, or cutting people off dramatically. And most of us just want peace. Exactly. Especially with family. You're not trying to punish anyone. You're trying to stay connected without shrinking yourself. And that changes how boundaries look. I've noticed the most effective boundaries are the quiet ones. The ones that don't demand change, they simply change your participation. Yes, that's a huge distinction. Instead of saying, "You can't talk to me like that," it often lands better as, "I'm not going to engage with this conversation." Same boundary, less friction. And it protects your nervous system. Because a lot of family belittling happens in moments where you're already vulnerable, tired, hungry, emotionally open. So a boundary might just be choosing timing. Not explaining big life decisions when you know criticism will come. That's not secrecy. That's self-regulation. Psychologically, you're reducing exposure to known triggers. Another thing that helped me was realizing boundaries don't require emotional honesty every time. You don't always need to explain your feelings. Sometimes neutrality is the boundary. Yes. Short, calm responses. I've thought about it. This works for me right now. I hear you. And then, no defense. No defense is powerful, because belittling often feeds on reaction. When there's nothing to push against, it loses momentum. That's straight nervous system science. When you stay regulated, the other person's intensity has nothing to mirror. I also think people underestimate how much boundaries can be nonverbal. Leaving the room, changing the subject, ending a call earlier than usual. No announcement required. Right. Boundaries are behaviors, not lectures. And consistency matters more than explanation. But here's the hard part. Guilt shows up, even when the boundary is gentle. Of course it does. Because many of us were raised to prioritize harmony over honesty. So when you choose yourself, it feels wrong even when it's healthy. That's when I remind myself, discomfort doesn't mean damage. It just means something old is being rewired. Exactly. The brain learns through repetition. Each time you hold a boundary calmly, you're teaching your nervous system that connection doesn't require self-abandonment. And sometimes, boundaries evolve. You don't start with big ones. You start small. Less explaining, less availability, more recovery time after family interactions. Those are protective boundaries. They give you space to breathe. And over time, something shifts. Either the dynamic softens or you stop absorbing the harm. Both outcomes are wins. But there's one more layer we haven't talked about yet. Even when you set boundaries, the internal voice of your family can still linger. Yes, that voice that keeps judging you long after the conversation ends. So next, we need to talk about how to rebuild your own inner authority, so their words stop echoing inside you. Because that's where real freedom begins. Can we talk about what boundaries actually sound like in real life? Because in theory, they're beautiful. In reality, you're standing in your kitchen, your parent just said something that hit a nerve, and your brain goes blank. Yes, boundaries don't happen in calm TED Talk moments. They happen mid-comment, mid-eye roll, mid-sigh. So let's make them human. Okay, say a parent constantly questions your choices, your job, your pace, your decisions. The old reaction is explaining, over-explaining, trying to prove yourself. A gentle boundary there might sound like, I know you're concerned. I've got it handled. And then, you stop talking. No justification. No data. No emotional defense. That pause is the boundary, not the sentence. Exactly. The boundary lives in what you don't add. What about siblings? Because siblings can be sarcastic in a way that feels casual, but cuts deep. Yes, the I'm just joking type. A boundary there could be as simple as, hey, that doesn't feel good to me. And if they brush it off, you disengage. Change the topic. Step away. Stop feeding the dynamic. That part is important. You don't argue about whether it should hurt. You just name your experience and remove yourself. Because boundaries aren't about convincing. They're about clarity. Another common one, family asking questions that feel intrusive. Money, relationships, plans. A boundary doesn't have to be confrontational. It can be, I'm not in the mood to talk about that today. Or even, I'll share when I'm ready. Then you redirect. And if they push, you repeat yourself calmly. Same tone, same words. That's consistency, and consistency teaches. I've also learned that some boundaries are about energy, not words. Like limiting how long you stay. Yes, time boundaries are powerful. Leaving before you're exhausted. Scheduling visits when you feel resourced. Not answering calls when you're emotionally depleted. That used to feel selfish to me. Same. Until I realized, drained people don't show up lovingly anyway. Regulation is relational. And sometimes the boundary is internal. Like deciding, I'm not going to absorb this comment. You notice it, let it pass, and remind yourself, this is their lens, not my truth. That's a cognitive boundary. and neuroscience supports it. When you don't emotionally engage, the brain weakens the old response loop over time. What I love about these boundaries is that they're quiet. They don't shame. They don't escalate. They protect without attacking. And they leave space for the relationship to remain, just without the constant self-betrayal. I think that's what people really want, not distance.
Dignity.
Yes, dignity and peace. But even when you start doing all of this, sometimes you still hear their voices in your head. The doubt, the criticism, the second-guessing. Which means the work isn't just external. It's internal too. You know what surprised me the most? Even after I learned how to handle the comments, even after I set boundaries, the voice was still there.
Yes.
Because by the time we're adults, family doesn't just live outside of us. They live inside us. That voice that says, don't get too excited. Be realistic. You're probably overestimating yourself. It doesn't sound cruel. It sounds familiar. Familiar voices are the hardest to question. Psychology talks about this as internalization. The brain absorbs repeated messages and turns them into self-talk. So even when the person isn't in the room anymore, their tone stays. And the nervous system trusts what it hears most often, not what's true, what's repeated. That's why healing the inner voice isn't about positive affirmations overnight. It's about building a new relationship with yourself. I had to start noticing the tone. Not the words, the tone. Was it harsh? Was it dismissive? Was it anxious? Because that's how I could tell. This isn't actually me. That awareness alone creates space. Once you see the voice, you're no longer inside it. Neuroscience backs this up. When you observe a thought without merging with it, the prefrontal cortex activates, the part of the brain responsible for regulation and perspective. You're literally stepping out of survival mode, which is huge, because that inner voice often developed when you were trying to stay safe, not confident. So instead of fighting it, I started responding to it, like I would a worried family member. Yes, not go away, but I hear you. That changes everything. For example, when the voice says, "What if this doesn't work?" I don't argue anymore. I say, "Thank you for trying to protect me. I've got this now." That's reparenting in action. You're offering yourself the reassurance you didn't consistently receive. And slowly, something shifts. The voice softens. Not because it disappears, but because it stops being in charge. Your nervous system learns a new authority.
You.
Another thing that helped was collecting evidence. Not big achievements, small moments of self-trust. Keeping promises to myself. Listening to my body. Saying no and surviving it. Because trust is built through experience, not reassurance. The brain needs proof. Each time you honor yourself, you weaken the old voice and strengthen the new one. That's neural rewiring. And it's slow, but it's kind. What I love about this work is that it doesn't require confrontation with family. It's private. It's gentle. It's yours. And it doesn't mean you love them less. It means you love yourself enough to stop abandoning yourself internally. When that inner voice changes, family comments lose their power. They don't vanish. They just stop defining you. You start hearing yourself louder than them. And that's freedom. So now that the inner voice is softening, what does life feel like when you're no longer constantly bracing yourself? That's the quiet, beautiful part. There's this moment that happens. And it's so quiet you almost miss it. Nothing dramatic changes. No big confrontation. No final conversation where everything suddenly makes sense. It's subtler than that. It feels more like relief. You realize you're not bracing yourself anymore. You're not rehearsing what you'll say. You're not shrinking before a comment even lands. You're not scanning the room for approval. Your body isn't on guard. And that's how you know something real has shifted. Your nervous system feels it before your mind does. Family conversations start to feel lighter. Not because they changed, but because you did. The comments don't hook you the same way. They still exist, but they don't live inside you anymore. And when something does sting, you notice it sooner. You don't spiral for days. You don't turn it into a story about who you are. You let it pass through instead of letting it take residence. That's emotional maturity. You start trusting your own reactions, your own joy, your own decisions. your own pace. You don't rush to explain yourself, because when self-trust is present, you don't need constant validation. The brain stops seeking safety externally, it has it internally. There's also grief here. A gentle one. Grief for the version of you that tried so hard to be understood. And compassion for the younger you who learned to survive through silence, humor, compliance, or overachievement. You don't shame her. You thank her. And something else happens. You begin to see your family more clearly. Without resentment, without fantasy. They're human, limited, wounded, trying, sometimes failing. And that clarity gives you freedom. You stop expecting them to become who you needed. And in doing that, you stop hurting yourself waiting. That's when peace enters. Not the loud kind, the grounded kind. You don't love them less. You just stop abandoning yourself in order to love them. And relationships become choices, not obligations soaked in guilt. Life feels simpler. Your voice feels steadier. Your boundaries feel natural, not rehearsed. You stop asking, "Am I allowed to be this person?" You already are. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, you're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're not too sensitive. You're healing. And healing doesn't make you colder. It makes you clearer. If this conversation felt like something you've lived, share it with someone who might need it too. And make sure you subscribe so you can keep walking this path with us. We're here. Same table. Same coffee. Same honesty. Take care of your heart, especially around the people who shaped it. We'll see you next time.